Thank you so much for the introduction. My name is Allison Wheeler. My pronouns are she, her. I am an advanced medium-term trainee, and I'm very excited to present my project today. This was actually done as a subset of my master's in genetic counseling capstone project as well. So the large project is quite technical, and I hope that this presentation will give you some information about genetics and what test results could be used for. So just a little disclosure about LEND being supported by the MCHB, HRSA. The information, content, and conclusions are all of my own and are not part of our HRSA, HSS, or the US government's positions or policies. So throughout this presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about the overview of the project that I did, give a little genetics 101 and talk about testing. We'll define what personal utility is, and then talk through the project in which I explored personal utility, the results of that project, and what that means. So the purpose of my project, as the name implies, is to understand the personal utility of a specific kind of genetic test, which is called whole genome sequencing, and I'll define in a minute, for adults who have neurodevelopmental disabilities. The setting of this project is a large research study that was done at UCSF for adults who have neurodevelopmental conditions, neurological conditions, psychiatric conditions, and have some interplay between these. So what we really wanted to do with this project is to give people information from this genetic test that can impact their medical management, especially people who've been on really long diagnostic odysseys and have been looking for answers. And so the major question of this project is, will personal utility, which I'll define again in a minute, differ between people who have different kinds of conditions within this study? So when we think about testing, and especially when we think about genetic testing, one of the ways that we define if a test is helpful and useful is that it will improve health outcomes by changing the way that we manage our health, adding in an intervention that we didn't think was available before. But really the goal in that situation of what we call clinical utility is, what can the information from this test do for my health? However, as genetic counselors, as people with genetic conditions, as people who support people with many different kinds of conditions know, there are so many impacts of testing in healthcare, and specifically genetic testing, that lie outside of how does it change our health. Especially when we think about genetic conditions that are often incredibly rare, we may not have an intervention, medical management changes that we can give to somebody because they may be one of a few people in the world who have that condition. And so this is where personal utility comes in, essentially identifying the non-health benefits of a test. So not what can this information do for my health, but what can it do for myself? And personal utility covers a lot of different aspects of our experiences. So it can impact things like how we plan for our future and how we plan to have a family. It can impact our identity and our self-knowledge. So identifying with a new community and finding support and resources. It can help us feel like we can cope with the health condition better. It can also impact our privacy and the way that we find social support. So all of these pieces are really important to the lived experience of genetic conditions, of neurodevelopmental conditions, and are a piece that we need to explore when we're using and developing new technologies in genetic testing to understand what is that impact on people. So a little bit of genetics 101. Our DNA is a lot of information that tells our body how we develop. That information is kind of a long string of letters that's packed into these structures called chromosomes. We have one copy of each chromosome we get from our parents. So we get all that information from our parents and we pass that information on if we have children. And so when we think about the complexity of all of that information, there are many things that can change. So there are some changes that tell us that our hair is going to be one color, but there are other changes that tell us that our heart might not work the way that we expect it to. And so when we do genetic testing, essentially, we want to identify if there are any of these changes in this big instruction manual that are going to impact the way that our body functions. So essentially, the goal of genetic testing is to identify if a person has a genetic condition or a predisposition, so they might develop a specific kind of medical condition that comes with medical concerns that we can provide support and management and changes in health outcomes for. And so for people specifically with neurodevelopmental disabilities, and especially with many of the participants in the study, we talk a lot about what will genetic testing do for the fact that I have a diagnosis of autism, for example. And genetic testing for people with neurodevelopmental disabilities is to essentially identify if there's a larger genetic condition at play that has medical management, but will not essentially give somebody a change in a gene that says this is why you have autism, because we don't have those genes. We don't have autism genes. We don't have ADHD genes. We have genetic conditions that we might see these neurodevelopmental disabilities come with in addition to these other genetic health implications, essentially. And so when I was speaking with many of the participants in this study who have different neurodevelopmental disabilities, many of them questioned why they had been referred here. And that was really the piece of it, is that we're not looking to diagnose a genetic reason why you have that condition. We want to make sure that your heart is functioning correctly because there are some genetic conditions that have both of those pieces. And so different kinds of genetic testing, as I mentioned earlier, can look at kind of a spell check of the genes to see if there is a change in a word, essentially, in the genetic code in the DNA. There might be changes in the amount of DNA that we have that can impact how our body functions and develops. And so there are many different kinds of genetic tests that use different technology to do this, to do the spell check, to count the chromosomes, to assess how much genetic information that we have. And these are kind of the standards of genetic testing that we use to find the different kinds of changes that we want. Recently, well, I don't know if I would say recently, but lately we've been exploring the application of a new type of genetic test called whole genome sequencing, which is, again, kind of the spell check of our DNA, but it captures a massive amount of information. And a lot of that information we might not know what to do with yet. So a lot of studies are exploring, can this test pick up genetic conditions that we haven't been able to pick up before? Can we get people a diagnosis that other tests can't? But with that, there's a massive amount of information that might impact people in other ways in their health, which is why the personal utility of this genetic test is important to evaluate. So this was done in the context of the ABCDEFG study at UCSF. I'm not going to say the name because it's almost longer than the acronym. But we wanted to support patients who either had some kind of genetic testing previously or hadn't, and ask them some questions about their experience. So for both people who had run through the gamut of all the genetic tests that we could offer and are now coming to us looking for answers, and people who have not had any genetic testing previously and are enrolling and kind of starting that process. We wanted to see if there was a difference there as well. So this is just kind of the workflow of showing that we ask people to complete surveys before whole genome sequencing, so this massive kind of genetic test, or WGS, as well as after. And we asked them a survey that we created to see, will whole genome sequencing contribute to somebody's self-knowledge? Will it satisfy their curiosity? Will it make them feel that they've taken responsibility for their health? All of this pulled from previous research that was done on personal utility to identify kind of these themes and areas. So as I mentioned, we asked it before whole genome sequencing and after to see, what do people believe genetic testing can provide to them? What will it actually provide to them? And is there a difference there? So for participants in the study who had neurodevelopmental disabilities, a majority of those participants were kind of in the 35 to 50-year-old range. A majority of them were white, not Hispanic or Latino, and identified as male. Additionally, one of the demographic pieces that we collected was who was completing the surveys that we asked patients to complete. Was it the participant themselves, or was it a healthcare representative like a family member? In terms of the testing that was done, I'm not going to dive too much into the results, but what we found was that people who have neurodevelopmental disabilities didn't receive diagnoses most of the time. They either got a negative result that gave them no answer, or they got an uncertain result where we're not really sure what to do with that information yet. People with other kinds of complex brain disorders, so neurological or psychiatric, without any neurodevelopmental component, received kind of similar test results. Some of them were positive, but But it's interesting just to kind of assess and see that there is a little bit of a difference in the health impacts between people with neurodevelopmental disabilities and people in the study who did not have that. So before whole genome sequencing, people who have neurodevelopmental disabilities had higher personal utility. So essentially, the impacts that they expected to get from whole genome sequencing were more and more positive than people who don't have neurodevelopmental disabilities. So I kind of split this up into these categories as well to see what were the areas of somebody's experience that they rated differently. So for example, self-knowledge, so thinking about knowing yourself better, identity, that was higher for people with neurodevelopmental disabilities, as was the value of information. Curiosity was on the flip side. So people who don't have NDDs actually rated that area higher, as they expect whole genome to give them more information about that area of their experience. So after whole genome sequencing, and I've added in kind of this border color what the pre-test responses were so that we can see how that changed, personal utility decreased for everybody. Part of that discussion includes thinking about the fact that most people did not get a diagnosis. So that might be a huge piece even of the non-health outcomes, impacting people's coping, impacting their self-knowledge. So we still see that people who have neurodevelopmental disabilities rated after this genetic test, their personal utility of the test was still higher. But we can see, for example, for coping for people who don't have NDDs, that dropped significantly. The value of information dropped a lot for people with NDDs. Self-knowledge is still higher for people with NDDs compared to people without them. So essentially, in the study, while people had these large buckets of neurodevelopmental, neurological, psychiatric conditions, there was also a lot of interplay and overlap with that. But we do see a little bit of a difference between people who have NDDs and people who don't have NDDs. Kind of as I talked through with the graphs there earlier, personal utility did decrease for everybody after whole genome. And while the purpose of exploring personal utility is to explore the non-health outcomes, given that nobody received a diagnosis in the study, that probably had a huge impact on this, on people's experience, on their self-knowledge. I had one participant tell me after the testing how relieved she was to not be diagnosed with an incredibly rare condition that could be picked up on whole genome. But I also had people who said, I really hope that this gives me an answer because I don't know what else to do. And so personal utility is a huge piece, I think, of either of those journeys, either getting that relief, not having a diagnosis, or wanting that to be the end of it. So those differences, just to reiterate, for people with neurodevelopmental disabilities, personal utility was higher both before and after the testing, even with those negative results. Scores didn't really change for curiosity and coping, kind of those areas of personal utility. But there were changes in people's identity and the value of that information. So in moving forward with more research, I think it's important to explore what the difference might be based on the kind of genetic testing result, because we really only saw these negative results and people didn't get answers. But just to further explore what that benefit is so that we can understand as genetics professionals, as other healthcare professionals and family members who are thinking about what genetic testing can bring to people, really considering all of those impacts outside of that. So thank you so much for listening to my presentation. If you want to ask any questions about genetics or genetic testing, you can email me, but I'm also happy to answer questions in the chat. So the question was in regards to the genetic test that we did, the chance that we're going to get a diagnostic result is quite low statistically. And are people understanding that before testing? And if they aren't, if that conversation isn't being had, when we have that, what might that change? And that is an important piece. And I will agree, the diagnostic yield, so the chance that we're going to get an answer from whole genome at this point is still relatively low. As I mentioned, there's a lot of information that we collect. We don't always know what to do with all of it. And a lot of that information we can get from other kinds of genetic testing. And so when we are consenting people to do the test, whether it's in a research study or they're paying out of pocket in a clinic, we are having that conversation with them, definitely. We are talking about the fact that oftentimes we've already done other kinds of genetic testing that have a higher chance, just statistically, of collecting, like identifying a diagnosis. So many people are coming to this test after the fact and recognize that there is a very low likelihood. For a number of these participants, we are doing the whole genome at the same time as those standard genetic tests. And so while we're having the same conversation and we're emphasizing the reason why we're not doing this test in a clinical setting, in a research setting, is because that yield is so low right now. The chance that we're going to get that answer is so low. And so we need to do more research and figure that out. But I do think that that journey that people have been on impacts what they take away from that conversation. Even if we have that conversation and we tell them, a very small number statistically, will they see themselves as the exception who falls into that number? Or will they see themselves as, oh, maybe this isn't going to be an answer? And so the number of people who were included in this kind of subset was quite low. We had 22 people overall who have completed whole genome at this point. And it's not very evenly split between people who've had other kinds of testing before and people who haven't. But I do think that as we expand the cohort and we do it for more people, that's something that I really want to look at. Is there a difference in terms of what people believe in and expect based on that? But I think that's a great question and really important.
The UC Davis Mind Institute was founded in 1998 with a promise to reduce and prevent the disabilities that can be associated with autism and other neurodevelopmental conditions. Every day, our clinicians and researchers make progress on that promise. Our groundbreaking research on autism, Fragile X syndrome, chromosome 22q11.2 deletion syndrome, ADHD, and other conditions associated with disability are helping affected individuals achieve their fullest potential. Please visit our website or our social media platforms to find out more about current studies, upcoming events, and how you can help make a difference.